The lights of the NBC studio were always too bright, a harsh artificial sun that never set, baking the stage in a wash of blue and gold. It was 1967, and Dean Martin was standing at the absolute apex of the world, the king of cool in his natural habitat, where everything dangerous looked effortless. The tuxedo never wrinkled, the glass never emptied, the smile never faltered. To the millions watching at home, he was the definition of grace under pressure, a man who could slide down a banister of razor blades and never cut his silk tie. The orchestra shimmered on cue, the applause washed over him like a familiar tide, and there he stood, drink in hand, tie slightly loose, that lazy half-smile sending a quiet message to every nervous soul watching. Relax, Dino's got it. He'd just finished a number, something slow and effortless that made even the boom operators forget they were at work. To his right, just off camera, his wife Jean waited to be introduced, not as a star, not as a prop, but as the woman who saw him without the spotlight, without the glass, without the armor of his legend. The interviewer was young, hungry, the kind of man who confused cruelty with courage and thought tearing down legends was the same as building his own reputation. He had that predatory grin, the one that said he knew where the real power sat, not in the band, not in the audience, but in the microphone clutched in his sweating palm. "And here's the lovely lady who lets this rascal come home at night," he announced with manufactured charm. Dean's better half, the very patient Mrs. Martin. Jean smiled, small and graceful, moving closer with the practiced elegance of a woman who'd learned to navigate the spotlight without being consumed by it. She was radiant in powder blue, ready to exchange pleasantries and disappear like a shadow behind a neon sign. But the interviewer wasn't finished. He leaned forward, eyes calculating, sensing an opportunity for the kind of moment that would make his career. The words that came next were designed to wound, a jagged, sneering remark about her appearance, her age, her worth as anything beyond an accessory to a famous man. It was the kind of comment that painted the Martin household as a broken carnival, that reduced a dignified woman to a punchline for America's entertainment. The audience didn't know how to react. Some laughed nervously, most went silent, but Dean heard every syllable, every cruel insinuation, every calculated attempt to humiliate the woman he'd built his life around while cameras captured her shame. The change in the room was physical, a sudden drop in pressure that made ears pop. Dean didn't shout. He didn't throw his glass or storm off the set. The effortless smile that had charmed the world for 20 years simply evaporated, revealing a face of stone. What emerged was something the audience had never seen. The man from Steubenville, the former boxer and croupier, who understood that some lines are drawn in blood. The silence that followed was louder than any applause. It was the silence of a man who had spent his life making everything look easy, but who would not, could not, let this pass. Dean moved. Not a lunge, not a grand gesture, but a slow, predatory step forward. The band kept playing because no one had told them to stop. The audience leaned in, expecting the usual deflection, the self-deprecating joke, the cool recovery. Instead, Dean reached out and gently took the microphone from the interviewer's hand. For the first time all night, he looked completely, devastatingly sober. He leaned in close enough that the boom microphones couldn't catch what he said, close enough that only the interviewer could see what lived behind those famously sleepy eyes. His lips moved once, just once. The words were whispered, but their effect was instantaneous. The interviewer's face drained of color like someone had opened a valve. His arrogance shattered into visible, trembling fear. 30 seconds later, the feed cut to black. Technical difficulties, they said. The episode never aired. The interviewer never worked in television again. And Dean Martin never spoke publicly about what he said in that moment, because men like Dean understood something the world had forgotten. Real power doesn't announce itself. It moves in whispers and leaves silence in its wake. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, But stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to that NBC studio in 1967, where the king of cool was about to show the world exactly what he'd sacrifice everything to protect. The studio always felt colder during a live broadcast, no matter how hot the lights burned. It was that kind of cold that lived under the skin, the chill of knowing that television in 1967 was still a high-wire act without a net. One wrong word could live forever in reruns, and Dean Martin had learned to turn that danger into comfort, stepping into it like a man into his favorite suit. But something darker was creeping into the formula. A new breed of interviewer was emerging, men who'd discovered that humiliation sold better than charm, that tearing down legends could build careers faster than celebrating them. They confused cruelty with courage, mistook shock for substance, and believed that making someone uncomfortable on camera was the mark of a real journalist. The interviewer that night was exactly that type. Sharp-suited and hungry, he was climbing the ladder through controversial moments, a predator who'd built his reputation on catching celebrities off guard and pressing their soft spots until something broke. His name doesn't matter now, because Dean made sure it wouldn't, but in 1967 he was eager and calculating, holding his microphone like a weapon. Dean stood center stage in his tuxedo, the fabric catching light like liquid midnight. His tie loosened just enough to suggest he'd already been somewhere more interesting. The orchestra had just finished backing him through a ballad, something slow and aching that made even the cameramen forget to check their angles. To the millions watching at home, he was proof that life could be smooth, that pressure was something you laughed at over a drink. Jean waited just off camera, powder blue dress catching the studio lights, her smile small and practiced. She was there as a favor, a rare public appearance to support her husband. The audience adored her, seeing the grace she brought to the wild orbit of the Rat Pack. But the interviewer saw something else, a target, a way to pierce the armor of the coolest man alive by striking at the softest part of his heart. The insult didn't come as a shout. It came wrapped in a smile, a snide, jagged comment about Jean's role in the marriage, a cheap shot that reduced her worth to nothing more than a tolerant accessory. It was the kind of sexism that passed for humor in boardrooms, but under the bright lights of a national broadcast, it sounded like a demolition. Jean didn't say a word. She maintained her composure, but Dean saw the flinch, microscopic, a tiny tightening around her eyes. To the millions watching at home, nothing had happened. But to Dean Martin, the boy from Steubenville who had fought his way out of steel mills and boxing rings, a declaration of war had just been issued. The transformation was terrifying because it was so quiet. The Dino persona evaporated instantly. Dean set his glass down, the clink against wood sounding like a gavel striking a judge's bench. His sleepy eyes snapped open, clear and hard as diamonds. He leaned forward, reached out with fluid, predatory movements, and gently took the microphone from the interviewer's hand. The studio audience, sensing the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure, fell deathly silent. Dean invaded the interviewer's personal space, closing the distance until they were breathing the same air. Then he whispered, not a theatrical whisper meant to be overheard, but a private communication delivered with the intimacy of a secret and the weight of a death sentence. We will never know the exact words, but we saw the result. Color draining from the interviewer's face, hands trembling, arrogance shattering into visible fear. Dean slowly pulled back, stood up, and offered his hand to his wife. He didn't look back at the devastation he'd left behind, simply walked Jean off the stage, shielding her from the lights, leaving a studio full of people wondering if they had just watched a career end in a whisper. The world thought they knew Dean Martin, and that was exactly how he wanted it. They saw the glass perpetually in hand, the tie perpetually loose, the eyes perpetually half-closed in amused detachment. They watched him stumble through sketches with perfect comic timing and assumed the stumble was real. America had fallen in love with a drunk who made not caring look like the highest form of sophistication. It was the greatest magic trick he ever pulled, convincing millions he didn't care, when in reality, he cared so much he built an invisible fortress to protect everything he loved. The amber liquid swirling in his glass on stage was almost always apple juice. The slur in his speech wasn't intoxication. It was a rhythmic choice, a master musician playing the audience like an instrument. While the rest of the Rat Pack was closing down the sands at 4 a.m, chasing the sunrise with one last round, Dean was usually in bed by 10 o'clock, treating his fame like a shift at the factory. When the whistle blew, he clocked out, went home, and left the King of Cool hanging in the wardrobe like an expensive suit. This discipline wasn't born in Hollywood boardrooms or Vegas dressing rooms. It was forged in the steel gray winters of Steubenville, Ohio, where young Dino Paul Crocetti learned that the world wasn't soft and survival meant reading a room faster than the room could read you. Before he was a legend, he was a butcher's son who spoke only Italian until he was 5, a boy who watched powerful men ruin weaker ones with a smile and understood something that would stay with him forever. Real power didn't shout or posture. It leaned back, watched, waited, and when it moved, it didn't miss. He dealt blackjack in illegal gambling dens before he could legally drink, studying desperate men making stupid decisions and learning the calculus of when to push and when to walk away. He boxed under the name Kid Crochet, stepping into rings where the violence was honest and the rules were clear. Those backroom punches and card tables taught him that there's performed aggression and there's real violence, and the gap between them is where smart men operate. You don't survive by being careless. You survive by being observant, by watching a man's eyes, by reading the tension in a room before the first punch is thrown. By the time Hollywood found him, all that hard-earned wisdom had been smoothed into charm. The drunk on stage became strategic camouflage, a way to slip through powerful circles appearing harmless while gathering information about who abused their power, who needed help, who deserved the kind of justice that never made headlines. Behind those sleepy eyes was a steel-town boxer who'd learned that the most effective punch is the one nobody sees coming. At the center of his carefully guarded world was Jean. She wasn't just a wife. She was the sanctuary, the one person who didn't need the act. She had known Dino before he was Dean, before the billboards and marquees, before Las Vegas turned his name into electric light. She knew the man who worried about his children, who felt the crushing burden of carrying every show, who would rather sit in his den watching silent westerns than attend the most exclusive party in Los Angeles. When she entered his orbit, she didn't become an accessory to his fame. She became the reason for his invisible boundaries. Decades later, his children would describe a father who was almost militantly normal, a man who enforced family dinners with the strictness of a general. The rule was absolute. No matter what was happening in the world, no matter who was calling, when Dean walked through that front door, the drawbridge came up. Their friends would come over and only later realize the man flipping channels in the den was one of the most famous entertainers in the world. He liked it that way. Fame belonged outside. Inside, he was just Dad. The pattern had been there for years if anyone cared to look. Dean stopping rehearsals when chorus girls were mocked by directors, his voice dropping to that dangerous register. Dean refusing jokes that punched down at crew members, rewriting scripts in real time to protect people who had no power to protect themselves. When a dancer struggled with hospital bills, an unmarked envelope appeared. No note, no signature. Years after his death, the children of those musicians would find old stories buried in family conversations, learning their grandfather always said he owed everything to Dean, but was never allowed to say it in public. Where others used power to expose, Dean used his to cover. Where others advertised their generosity, he buried his. The onstage clown let himself be the target, so no one else had to be. He understood that real integrity doesn't announce itself. It moves in the margins, in dressing rooms and closed-door meetings, in phone calls made at midnight to help people who would never know his name was attached to their salvation. So, when that interviewer made his snide remark about Gene, he wasn't just cracking a joke or pushing for ratings. He was trying to kick down the door of Dean's sanctuary, mistaking the relaxed public persona for weakness, assuming that the man who laughed at everything would laugh at this too. He didn't realize he was poking a sleeping prize fighter. He didn't see that the cool wasn't apathy, it was armor. And he was about to learn, in the most humiliating way possible, that the man who makes the difficult look easy is often the most dangerous when you threaten what he holds dear. The world saw a drunk smile vanish that night. The people who really knew him saw something else. The moment Dino from Steubenville stood up inside Dean Martin and decided someone had to learn what his silence usually prevented. The studio didn't know how to breathe after the feed cut to black. It was the silence of a held breath, heavy and suffocating, where technicians stood frozen at their stations with hands hovering over switches they'd been trained to flip, but suddenly couldn't touch. The orchestra members sat with instruments in their laps, eyes darting between each other, trying to decode what had just happened in the space between entertainment and something far more dangerous. The audience remained suspended in their seats, caught in that strange liminal space where they couldn't tell if what they'd witnessed was part of the show or the end of something much bigger. Dean walked Gene past the cameras, past the boom operators, past the makeup artists who pressed themselves against the walls to let them through. His hand never left the small of her back, a gesture of protection so deliberate it created an invisible corridor through the chaos. He didn't look at anyone, didn't acknowledge the producer rushing toward him with panic written across his face, just kept moving with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who'd already made every decision that mattered. The interviewer stood frozen where Dean had left him, clutching air where the microphone had been, his face drained of the practiced arrogance that had defined his career only moments before. In the dressing room, there was no explosion. No thrown objects, no raised voices, no theatrical display of anger that would give the studio something to manage or contain. Dean sat down on the leather couch, loosened his tie the rest of the way, and simply existed in a silence so heavy it had physical weight. Jean sat beside him, her hand in his, and they stayed that way for what felt like an hour, but was probably only minutes. The rage wasn't absent. It was compressed, controlled, focused into something far more dangerous than a tantrum. It was the terrifying stillness of a man deciding exactly how much ruin he was about to inflict. Outside, the network was hemorrhaging. Phones were ringing in executive offices across Los Angeles, voices sharp and strained, barking questions nobody wanted to answer. They understood something crucial. Dean wasn't like other stars who needed the spotlight to survive. He could disappear tomorrow, go back to his den and his westerns, and be perfectly content. The network needed him far more than he needed them. In 1967, the Dean Martin brand wasn't just a show. It was a machine that moved money, ratings, advertising, casino, bookings. This wasn't the first time Dean had drawn these invisible lines. There were stories whispered in green rooms about the night he refused to take the stage until Sammy Davis Jr. was allowed through the front entrance, not the service door. The film set where he quietly told a director that if the young actress was replaced for refusing the producer's advances, he'd walk too. The recording session where he stopped mid-song because an engineer made a cruel joke about a janitor's accent. Dean never made public statements about these moments. He simply used his power like a scalpel, making precise cuts that removed problems without fanfare. Finally, Dean reached for the phone. No theatrics, no raised voice. Just a number he knew by heart. A direct line to a network executive who understood what it meant when Dean Martin called personally. He spoke in that same soft, unhurried tone that had turned the interviewer's face to chalk. The message was simple. A line had been crossed, and anyone who didn't understand that would not be part of his world. By the time he hung up, the interviewer's career had already begun its quiet, methodical death. Television in the mid-60s was a carnival mirror reflecting America's ugliest instincts back at itself with a laugh track. Variety shows thrived on humiliation disguised as entertainment, where comedy writers competed to land the meanest punch, and hosts measured success by how uncomfortable they could make their guests. Women were props, minorities were punchlines, and the vulnerable were fair game. It was an industry that confused shock with substance, where cruelty wore the mask of wit and power protected power by stepping on anyone who couldn't fight back. Dean Martin moved through this world like a man walking through a minefield with a map only he could read. On stage, he appeared to be part of the machinery, another cog in the entertainment complex that chewed up dignity and spat out ratings. But people who worked with him noticed something strange. He never seemed to enjoy the jokes that punched down. When writers pitched material mocking someone's weight, accent, or background, Dean would nod, smile that famous smile, and then quietly rewrite the bit during rehearsal. The target would shift from the powerless extra to himself, absorbing the mockery so someone else didn't have to carry it home. The stories accumulated in the margins where cameras never pointed. A trumpet player missed 2 rehearsals. No one knew why. Pay envelopes went out that week, and his was thicker. The bandleader later found a folded check with Dean's name in the memo line and a single word written on the back. Shh. A struggling stagehand's wife needed surgery. The hospital bill was mysteriously taken care of. The stagehand died years later, telling his grandson, "If you ever see Dean Martin on TV, you stand up. That man saved your grandmother." 50 years on, that boy would find an old Polaroid of his grandfather with Dean beside him, hand on his shoulder, both mid-laugh. No reporters, no announcements, just a moment between 2 men, one of whom had quietly kept the other's world from breaking. A studio musician kept his family afloat for 2 years on what he thought was steady session work, only learning at Dean's funeral that there had been no sessions. Dean had simply kept him on an invisible payroll, calling him in to play on recordings that didn't exist, protecting his pride while saving his family. There were dozens of these stories, scattered across Dean's career like hidden landmines of grace. The drunk persona wasn't just entertainment, it was strategic positioning. By appearing careless and slightly foolish, he could move through powerful circles gathering information about who abused their authority, who needed help, who deserved the kind of justice that never made headlines. Studio executives spoke freely around him, assuming the man with the perpetual drink was too checked out to care or remember. They were wrong on both counts. Dean used what he learned surgically. A producer known for coercing young actresses would suddenly find Dean unavailable for projects. A director who screamed at crew members would arrive on set to find Dean had negotiated better contracts for everyone below the line. He never made speeches or issued statements. He simply moved pieces on a board most people didn't know existed. That NBC interviewer thought he was dealing with a drunk celebrity who would laugh off any insult. He didn't realize he was facing a man who'd spent decades perfecting the art of invisible warfare. The whisper that ended the broadcast wasn't an aberration. It was the moment Dean decided this particular predator needed to learn what his silence had been preventing all along. Within months, the interviewer would be gone, not fired dramatically, but slowly reassigned, marginalized, finally released. His career dismantled with the same quiet efficiency Dean brought to everything that mattered. Being effortless is the most exhausting performance in the world. Every night, Dean walked onto stages and into living rooms, carrying the crushing weight of making millions believe that nothing ever hurt, that pressure rolled off him like water off marble, that life was just a series of smooth moments strung together with a song and a smile. The audience needed him to be untouchable, so he became untouchable. They needed him to float above the chaos, so he learned to float. But gravity still existed in the dressing room, in the quiet car rides home, in the moments between takes when the mask came off and revealed the spiritual fatigue underneath. There was a specific kind of loneliness reserved for people who made everything look easy, not the loneliness of being alone. Dean had plenty of people around him, always. This was the loneliness of being fundamentally misunderstood, of knowing that the world loved a version of him that didn't quite exist while missing the man who actually did. His generosity had to stay hidden because revealing it would crack the persona. His sensitivity had to be buried because showing it would make him seem weak. So he absorbed ugliness that should have been shared, carried burdens that should have been divided, and smiled through it all because that's what the king of cool was supposed to do. The exhaustion wasn't physical tiredness, but something deeper, a bone-deep weariness that came from wearing armor that grew heavier with each passing year. He would come home from the studio, shed the tuxedo like a snake shedding skin, and retreat into the sanctuary of silence. Not angry silence, just the quiet of a battery recharging. He'd sit in his den, watch golf or old westerns, and simply exist without performing. To the outside world, this looked like aloofness. Friends complained he was distant. Other celebrities whispered that he was cold. They didn't understand that he had given every ounce of his warmth to the camera and his family, leaving nothing for the cocktail parties and networking dinners that fueled Hollywood. His relationships fractured under the weight of his unexplained goodness. People he'd helped anonymously would feel hurt that he never acknowledged them publicly, not understanding that public acknowledgement would destroy the entire architecture of how he moved through the world. Others mistook his silence for indifference, his refusal to discuss his pain for not having any. The drunk persona became a moat around a castle, keeping people at exactly the distance he needed them to stay, close enough to feel his warmth, far enough that they couldn't see the cracks. There were nights when the weight became visible, when crew members would catch him staring at nothing between takes, the light gone from his eyes. Moments when the effortless smile took just a fraction too long to appear, revealing the machinery underneath. But he'd shake it off, crack a joke at his own expense, and step back into character before anyone could ask if he was okay. Because admitting he wasn't okay would mean admitting the whole thing was hard, and if it was hard, then what was the point of the act? He couldn't afford to have bad days. The night his child was sick, the network still expected the grin. When a marriage argument hung in the air like a storm, the cue cards still moved on schedule. If a friend betrayed him in the afternoon, there was still a perfectly timed punchline waiting for him at 8 o'clock on live television. The show must go on, they said. No one ever asked what it cost the man holding it together. This burden of silent protection would face its ultimate, crushing test years later with the death of his son, Dean Paul. For a man who had spent his life fixing things, smoothing over rough edges, and protecting his family from the world's cruelty, this was the one tragedy he couldn't prevent, the one pain he couldn't absorb for someone else. It broke something in him that never fully healed, revealing what people close to him had always known. The cool wasn't armor against pain. It was a performance he gave so others wouldn't have to carry his weight on top of their own. Jean understood this burden more than anyone. In rare interviews decades later, her voice would soften when she talked about that night at NBC, about watching her husband transform from the relaxed entertainer into something ancient and protective. She described loving a man the entire world believed they knew intimately, while understanding they'd never met the real person. The drunk they adored was a character. The cool they envied was a shield. The real Dean was the man who whispered warnings to protect her dignity, who came home for dinner every night, who carried the exhaustion of making everything look easy so his family never had to see how hard it actually was. A former bandmate captured the entire contradiction years later, staring at an old photograph with something like reverence in his voice. Dino could take any joke you threw at him. He'd laugh harder than anyone, make himself the punchline, turn his own pain into entertainment. But if you made a joke about someone he loved, if you tried to hurt someone who couldn't defend themselves, the temperature in the room would drop 20 degrees. You'd suddenly remember he was from Steubenville, that he'd been a boxer, that the relaxed guy with the drink had hands that knew how to break things. And you'd understand that all that cool, all that easy charm, it wasn't weakness, it was restraint. The story of that night at NBC was never meant to survive. There were no reruns, no bootleg recordings, no grainy clips surfacing decades later on nostalgia programs. Officially, it was technical difficulties, a segment lost to the fragile nature of live broadcasting in 1967. But television may erase tapes. It cannot erase memory. The people who were in that studio carried the moment with them like a secret ember, passing it along through the quiet circuits where real stories travel. A lighting technician mentioned it to his son over dinner. A makeup artist whispered it to a friend in a dim bar. A band member told it on a tour bus, his voice dropping as if Dean might somehow hear him and remind him that some things were meant to stay private. The ripples from that whispered warning spread through the industry like hairline cracks through ice, invisible to the public, but felt by everyone who worked behind the curtain. Without memos or meetings, without official policy changes, the rules around Dean Martin simply shifted. Writers began approaching his material differently, adding an unspoken asterisk to their scripts about family, about boundaries, about the difference between his easy nature and permission to cross lines. Hosts who specialized in ambush journalism suddenly found scheduling conflicts when Dean's name appeared on booking sheets. The casual cruelty that defined so much of 60s television had met something immovable, and it quietly learned to flow around him instead of through him. This is where the mythology breaks down and character emerges. The Rat Pack legend is all swagger and cigarette smoke, martinis that never empty, and parties that never end. Frank Sinatra fought his battles loudly and publicly, turning conflict into headlines. Sammy Davis Jr. fought through sheer, undeniable talent, forcing the world to recognize his worth. But Dean fought in the shadows, understanding that real power doesn't need an audience. His heroism was intimate, deliberate, and completely untelevised. He wasn't trying to change the entertainment industry. He was just protecting his corner of it, one quiet stand at a time. Somewhere in a family album, tucked between vacation photos and birthday parties, sits a picture that never made it into magazines. It's slightly blurred, taken from the wings of that NBC stage before everything went wrong. Dean stands half in shadow, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, looking tired in the way that only comes from carrying invisible weight. His arm encircles Jean's shoulders, not possessively but protectively, shielding her from the chaos of the backstage world. He's not looking at the camera. Even in this private moment, his eyes scan the room with that old Steubenville instinct, reading faces, measuring threats, always watching for the next person who might need defending. In his final years, Dean sat in his favorite chair watching the world through quiet windows, the king of cool alone with his thoughts. No audience to charm, no persona to maintain, just a man who had spent a lifetime making difficult things look effortless. On a nearby shelf sat that small framed photograph from 1967, a reminder that his greatest performance wasn't a song or a sketch or a movie role. It was the whisper that ended a career to protect someone he loved. The moment when character mattered more than celebrity. When the man from Steubenville stood up inside Dean Martin and reminded the world that some lines are drawn in blood. The people who were there never forgot the temperature change in that room, never forgot watching Effortless become dangerous. They carried that story forward like proof that beneath all the performance and illusion, real integrity existed when nobody was watching and became absolute when someone dared to cross it.